Welcome to this archaeology class. This one is to be called To the Ends of the Earth, the Settlement of Australia, the Americas and Polynesia. Starting with this opening slide, which I hope quite a few people will recognise as a Native American totem pole. Strictly speaking, a First Nations totem pole, as the Native Canadians call themselves, First Nations. Symbolizing what we're going to talk about today. Just to be different, if you like. I took this photograph in 2011, but I didn't take this photograph in Canada. This totem pole was carved by members of the Squamish group of First Nations people from Squamish in British Columbia, the place I have been to. I've got a friend who lives there, but this photograph was actually taken in Orkney. It's the Holm totem pole, carved and erected in 2008, and placed at the end of the first Churchill barrier, the mainland end of the first Churchill barrier in Orkney. It's a authentic First Nations totem pole. It was carved by four Canadian First Nations carvers, plus a lad from Fife called Kenny Grieve. But I thought it nicely sort of symbolises a lot of Scottish people went to Canada, and First Nations material is sort of now coming back, if you like. It's full circle round the globe. So, to the ends of the Earth. And as I said, the Earth is a globe, a sphere, not flat. I'm quite keen to assert that fact, despite all the flat Earth graffiti that seems to have appeared in Edinburgh relatively recently. But yes, the Earth is a sphere. It is slightly flattened at the ends, a flattened sphere. So if there are ends of the Earth, there will be the North Pole and the South Pole, the Arctic and the Antarctic. The photograph on the left, these are not my photographs, the photograph on the left was taken above the Arctic Circle in the far north of Russia, and the photograph on the right was taken within the Antarctic Circle, near the South Pole in the south there. Probably most of the history of archaeology, as long as there's been archaeology, it was thought that land north of the Arctic Circle was unpopulated until after what geologists and archaeologists call the last glacial maximum, the last time glaciers extended across much of northern Europe. Certainly the whole of Scotland would be covered in an ice sheet, kilometre deep. This ice sheet extended as far south as the Thames Valley in England, out across the North Sea, over Scandinavia, and on up to the Arctic Circle. And it was, as I say, thought that prior to this, no one lived north of the Arctic Circle, and people only started to migrate there after the ice melted. And the oldest known site until the last couple of decades was 13,000 years old. However, as I said, in the last 20 years, a completely different story is emerging. Excavations in the permafrost along the banks of the River Yana in Siberia have revealed a sophisticated culture living there, which has been dated to 30,000 years ago, so prior to the peak of the last ice age, rather than after the peak of the last ice age. These sites were discovered after a Russian geologist found the foreshaft of a spear made from woolly rhino bone, extinct woolly rhinoceros. This attracted the attention of archaeologists, who then uncovered stone tools, animal bones, multiple artifacts, lots of materials made out of mammoth ivory, and 6,000 plus beads at this first site. There are now multiple sites. You can see the archaeologists there planning one, and you can see lots of very large bones from extinct large mammals. These multiple sites are all clustering around that 30,000 year age. Some of them may be older. It's been suggested some of them are possibly as old as 45,000 years old. This is not confirmed. It's confirmed that they're much older than we thought they would be, the 30,000 year date, but the confirmation of dates older than that, up to 45,000 years, hasn't happened yet. And that's a proposal that people are still working on. The other question that arises, because of where this has been found, in North and Eastern Siberia, were these the ancestors of the Native Americans? That is also ongoing research, genetics research, in addition to the archaeology. Watch this space. They may not. Some of them may have been the ancestors of ancient North Americans. Even if these people weren't, it's generally thought that the ancestors lived in that part of the world. Watch this space. The photograph on the right, and as I said, photographed in Antarctica, way down south, and it's the interior of Sir Ernest Shackleton's Cape Royds hut, built for his expedition to the South Pole, or attempting to get to the South Pole, between 1908 and 1913. The Antarctic represents the last place on Earth where humans visited, and the only continent where humans aren't living there. Antarctic bases have people live 360 years, they overwinter there, but they're not settled, they're not living communities. No one is born, lives and dies in the Antarctic. And that's the only continent on Earth where that is the case. It's more comparable to the International Space Station, which is permanently occupied, but it's not a living human community. The huts are archaeological sites, sites of great heritage interest. They were being crushed by the ice in winter and flooded by snowmelt in summer. Since 2005, there's been multiple expeditions of multiple experts to restore, study, catalogue more than 18,000 artifacts within the huts: clothing, scientific equipment, cases of whiskey. As the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust put it, anyone who has had the privilege of visiting these sites will realise they are very special. They represent the very boundaries of human exploration at the time that were built 100 years ago. As I said, although there are permanent settlements, there are no permanent human communities in the Antarctic. No one born there lives there and dies there. There have been human remains found in Antarctica. The oldest known human remains, the so-called Yamana skull, were found in 1985 on a beach in the South Shetland Islands, belonging to an indigenous woman from southern Chile in her early 20s. But these are not ancient remains as such. She is thought to have died between 1819 and 1825, and was most likely working at a majority European sealing camp. However, just to show how archaeology is tied up with 20th and 21st century politics, the fact of the existence of her skull, and it was found in Antarctica, so she clearly died there, is now being used to support Chile's claim of territory in the Antarctic. Even though, as an indigenous woman, she probably wasn't a Chilean citizen. The Earth, in its flattened representational form. So we are going to be, if all humans, and they probably did, probably, balance of probability, we all evolved, all of our ancestors evolved in Africa in green. You can see Europe in blue and Asia in yellow. Asia is directly connected by land to Africa, and Europe is almost connected. It's very, very close. So it's easy to see how how our very early ancestors could settle, could come so-called out of Africa and settle Eurasia, Europe and Asia. Less easy to understand, and what we're looking at today is the settlement of the Americas in orange here, Australia, bottom right, in red, and across the Pacific, so Polynesia, the Polynesian Triangle, which most of which really doesn't show up on this map, apart from red, bottom right, New Zealand, also in red. The last place on Earth to be properly settled by humans. So that for there to be a living human community, the Maori, that is the last real place where humans got to and then set up living communities. We'll start with Australia though, seemingly a long way from home if Africa is home. This is, I mentioned the last glacial maximum in reference to Siberia. Well, this is a map of Australia at the same time, and that's about 20,000 years ago. And note that what's called Sahul on this map is a large continent that consists of Australia as it is now, plus New Guinea, and they're all joined together, and everything between them would be land and settleable land. A lot of underwater archaeology going on in Australia as we speak. It's cutting edge stuff, but it's believed there's huge areas of land that were previously settled are now flooded, and it's a key aspect of Australian archaeology in the 21st century. Not also what is called Sunda on this map, but also a large area of land flooded by Indonesia and Borneo, both being connected to the Asian mainland. So, what is the oldest site in Australia? This is the oldest site in Australia. The strangely named to our eyes today, Lake Mumbo. The picture on the left, as you can see, there's no lake there now. There was a lake there in prehistory. It's desert and not very much else now. It's part of the Willandra Lakes region. These were Pleistocene lakes which dried up approximately 18,000 years ago. They dried up after as the Ice Age started to come to an end. Now, one of the world's most important archaeological sites. In 1968, Jim Bowler discovered the cremated remains of a female indigenous person, Aboriginal, and this is now dated to around about 40,000 years ago. So, an older confirmed date that we can give to the Siberian remains, for example. And this is now the oldest ritual cremation site known in the world. In 1974, the skeleton on the right-hand photograph was found, so-called Mungo man. It's a male skeleton, and this has been also dated to 40,000 years ago. This is now some of the earliest evidence of Homo sapiens, us, our species, outside Africa. The evidence of occupation deposits established that humans had dispersed as far as Australia by 42,000 years ago. There are sites now coming up in Australia which are putting dates possibly even 10,000 years before that, but as I say, the really old dates, as everywhere, are still contentious. The 40,000 year date is not contentious. That's accepted scientific consensus. The site was occupied for thousands and thousands of years. Traces of complex food gathering systems that date back to probably around about 20,000 years ago. These are associated with grindstones to produce flour from wild grass seeds. They have been processing plants to make flour, at about the same time, we used to think that, well, at the same time that was happening in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, which we used to think of as the first time and place where that sort of process happened. It was not the first time and place. It was also happening in Australia, at least. Fossils of extinct giant marsupials have been found, so-called megafauna. This is another factor that comes up time and again. When humans arrive somewhere new, other animals tend to go extinct. It's probably a little bit more complicated than that. A combination of human overhunting, climate change, and possibly other factors. That's another area of research in which, you know, if you put 3 archaeologists in a room, you'll have 4 different opinions. The fact of the extinction of the megafauna and it generally coincides with humans arriving somewhere is a fact. The explanation is still being worked out. Mumbo has produced a full range of what, if it was found in Europe, would be called Paleolithic stone toolkit, scrapers, spears, knives, a complex, sophisticated technology. Primitive isn't the appropriate word. It's made out of stone and organic materials, but it's a full toolkit. That doesn't include the Swiss Army knife in the right-hand photograph. That's there for scale, but what that photograph does show is thousands and thousands of marine mollusks, marine shells. Sorry, probably freshwater rather than marine, demonstrating that this clearly was wetland once upon a time, lakes once upon a time, and these were probably gathered as food or as bait for fishing to catch other food. In 2003, at the same spot, which in 1981 was declared a World Heritage Site, in recognition of the global importance of this site. In 2003, fossil trackways were discovered. I love this photograph. I wish I had taken it. It's such a human thing, a footprint in the sand. And I don't think that's just because I'm missing being able to go to the beach. Fossil trackways, it's not just one fossil footprint being found. That tells us humans were there, but it doesn't tell us very much else. These are whole trackways, different sizes, different age, people, presumably, adults, children. These date between 19,000 and 23,000 years old. And because there are so many of them, and they greatly add to the information that we can gather about what people were doing. You know, this is a you can see people interacting. You can see who walked with whom, get some sort of idea of living people, which is often not really from the stones and the bones. The other thing I'd like to emphasize, ancient Australia. Australia before Europe, so-called European contact colonization. People living there for a long time. There's great diversity of environments. We often think of Australian Aborigines, think of the film Walkabout, a loincloth, a spear, and walking and wandering in the desert. Sure, some Australian Aborigines do and did live in harsh desert environments. Australia has tropical to temperate environments. Most Australian Aboriginals prior to European contact lived where most Australians live now. They mostly lived on or near the coast and in productive, complex ecosystems with productive, complex societies adapted to those ecosystems. There's no one Australian Aboriginal culture. Some of them were hunter-gatherers, some of them were agriculturists, some of them were horticulturists. There's evidence for fish farming. There's evidence for settlements with earth houses. There's evidence for settlements with stone houses. This is something that anthropology and archaeology is now only really recognizing and bringing to the public attention, along with the fact that we don't know this because most of these societies have disappeared. Disappeared is a weasel word in a way, and many of them were basically killed off. So, from Australia to the Americas, where stereotypes abound in the same way as they do in Australia. The painting on the left is your typical, your stereotypical Plains Indian teepee settlement. It's a beautiful painting. I'm not criticising the artist at all. Carl Bodmer painted this in 1833. I think it's quite a good, probably a very good representation, and it's not unsympathetic. It's probably quite a good record. You can see the teepees, you can see domesticated dogs, you can see women working. But this is our cow. This is not false, but it's only a tiny part of the picture. This is our Cowboys and Indians picture of Native Americans, American Indians. Teepee is a Lakota word, by the way. It is one of their words that has entered our language. This is how some Native Americans lived, but it certainly doesn't represent how all Native Americans lived by any means, and possibly even more key to understanding this represents how these people lived, so-called Plains Indians, only part of the year while they were hunting buffalo. The archaeological evidence, this is why the painting is such a good thing to have, because the archaeological evidence has mostly been destroyed. We have very little archaeological evidence of these settlements. They are quite ephemeral. The picture on the right is one of the pieces of evidence we do have, and it's doubly useful, if you like, because it can be actually tied to the historical record that we also have, which is that in 1844, explorer John C. Fremont was leading his second American expedition to map the Oregon Trail. He and his party came upon a large village of Pawnees, a group of Plains Indians, living in teepees, like in the painting, along the Smoky Hill River in Kansas. Fremont didn't realize this at the time, but they were gathered there for their annual bison hunt. They actually normally lived in earth lodges. We'll see some pictures of the types of houses that were more permanent settlements next. They normally lived in these earth lodges further north. And that year's hunt turned out to be one of the Pawnee Nation's last. Their people had been decimated by disease, by crop failure, and of course by warfare with European settlers. And then in 1873, the Pawnee Nation was forced to move to so-called Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And the tract of land that they would use for that they would come to this annually for hunting, was purchased by a local cattle rancher. And it's now the Pawnee Teepee Ring Site and Golden Spring Beach, and it's now a recognised monument. Excavations were held there between 2013 and 2016, which discovered that remains of the Pawnee's teepees were still almost entirely intact. This is said to be possibly the only teepee ring site left in Kansas, because they've been destroyed by cultivation of the land. It's very unusual for a private landowner to have chosen, if you like, to preserve an archaeological site. So, yes, it was a near unique site. I said Native Americans, even the ones who did live in teepees some of the year, that wasn't their permanent home, if you like. On the left is a recreation of one of the earth lodges I mentioned, where those people would be living for most of the year. A huge timber framed building, a large building made out of large timbers, and then with earth piled up around it, and probably some sort of thatch on the roof. It'd be very well insulated, it'd be warm, dry in the winter. And this is in a state park in North Dakota, and this was built by the Mandan people, which is another group similar to the Pawnee, another group of Plains Indians. But what I want to emphasize is that we probably think of, from all the cowboy movies, Indians as sort of ragtag bands. They're mobile teepees, wrongly called wigwams, usually, often. And that was only one aspect of their lives. Their lives were much more settled than that, and complex and sophisticated, and in different ways. The photograph on the right shows, strangely, it's from the Milwaukee's Public Museum, but it's a diorama of a Canadian, British Columbian, the Kwakiutl people, who live around Vancouver, north and south of there on the coast. So-called complex hunter-gatherers lived in. They didn't have agriculture. They had close to what you might call fish farming, but living off a highly productive ecosystem, the sea. And producing complex, sophisticated societies, living in large, permanent, wooden-built villages, some of which are still standing. Not very many of them. A lot of them were didn't survive European colonization, and that's what I wish to emphasise. This is all the complexity of Native American life long before 1492. When Columbus arrives in the Caribbean, this is a hierarchical society in a way that other Native Americans weren't. This is a slave owning society. The Native Americans to their south in California were militantly opposed to the very concept of owning slaves, whereas the Northwest Coast people owned slaves captured from other native groups. I mentioned that not to sort of denigrate them as slave owners, but just to demonstrate that multiple different types of social organisation existed in North America. Multiple different types of complicated, interesting, complex societies. But who were those first Native Americans, the first people, probably, to come from Asia, from Siberia? Who got there first? This is the so-called Clovis Point. Characteristically, you find thousands and thousands and thousands of these across North America, and as far south as the north of South America. It's named for the type site, which is the town of Clovis in New Mexico, in the United States. And these instantly recognizable, if you like, fluted points. It's a distinct style, a distinct way of making these points, which may have been spear points, they may have been knives. They come in lots of different sizes, from sort of 4 centimeters to 20 centimeters long. These all date to the so-called early Paleo-Indian period, roughly 12,800 to 13,500 years ago. First found in 1929, and since then have thought to be the archaeological and scientific consensus was that these represent the first people. These were produced by the first Americans, the first people to settle in the Americas and to spread throughout a large area of the Americas, as I said, most of North America and as far south as parts of South America. And then these occupy a specific time in the archaeological record, and then are gradually replaced by so-called Folsom points, which are thought to represent either a development of the Clovis people or perhaps another sort of wave of migration. But these blades, these points, give the name to the Clovis first theory of early migration to the Americas. Until very recently, Clovis first, these were made by the first people, was far and away the consensus opinion. It's the Clovis first hypothesis, I should say, suggests that people crossed from Siberia to North America, traveling down through an opening in the ice sheet. This is the so-called ice-free passage ice-free corridor hypothesis, which is said to have opened. This ice-free corridor is said to have opened about over 14,000 years ago, 14,800 years ago. Clovis sites cluster around 13,000. They were the oldest known. People put two and two together, and not unreasonably, came up with the Clovis first. Anyone challenging this until the last sort of couple of decades, probably really into the 21st century, anyone challenging this was considered fringe. I mean, there were reasonable and respectable archaeologists who did challenge Clovis first, but it was unassailable as the dominant hypothesis. Is it now? Were there people pre-Clovis? Were there people in the Americas prior to the arrival of the Clovis Points, presumably carried and made by the so-called Clovis people? Well, the photograph on the left, lovely verdant river valley with the grazing cattle. I think that could have been photographed in Scotland. It wasn't. I'll say where in a bit. Excavations starting in the 1970s. Archaeologists started excavating here in the 1970s under a peat bog, excavating through a peat bog. Artifacts and remains had been eroding out of the peat. This also happens in Scotland. So archaeologists came in to excavate through, unearthed numerous artifacts, the remains of huts, food scraps from extinct megafauna again, extinct large mammals, and wads of masticated seaweed, chewed seaweed, probably chewed for medicinal purposes, or at least to clean your teeth. Exceptional preservation at this site of organic material, preserved under the peat. There is no doubt this is a human site, a prehistoric human site. The stone point on the right represents the typical stone points found at this site. That is clearly not a Clovis point. Not necessarily a problem. It could have been any people after the Clovis people, but it isn't. This place is probably going to be in every archaeology textbook for as long as there are archaeology textbooks now. So where is this? There's a place called Monteverde. It's about 30 miles from the Pacific, but it's in southern Chile, way down south in South America, about as far south as you can get without ending up in Antarctica. And a long way from a long way south, a long way from the Clovis sites, which are further north. So far, so good. What are its dates? Its initial dates are that it is over 14,000 years old. There have been excavations of deeper layers suggesting humans were here at Monteverde possibly as early as 19,000 years ago. But again, remember the older the dates, the older the dating, the harder it is to confirm. But it's consensus now is that this is a pre-Clovis site, that not only were human beings in the Americas before the people who made the Clovis Points, but human beings were in the Americas as far south as southern Chile, about far south as you can get, before the people who made the Clovis Points. As often happens in archaeology, something doesn't exist till it's found, and can be said to, that can't exist, and then you find one, and now there are lots of pre-Clovis sites, an ever-increasing number, because once it's accepted and people are looking for them, we're now reaching the point that Clovis first is going to become fringe. A note of caution: there's some publications have published some very early dates from South America. I mean, we're talking not 14, 15,000 years ago, but 20,000 years plus. And I've even seen some which would sort of predate Homo sapiens, something, you know, 100,000 years old and older. I would read these with great caution for the very early dates. But research is ongoing. This is from an excavation that was published in 2019, if I remember rightly. It's called Cooper's Ferry, another river valley note. This is in the United States this time. This is further north from Monteverde, in western Idaho in the US. Stone tools, as we see on the right, a whole suite of really nicely made stone tools of lots of different types. And remember again that so-called Stone Age people didn't just make things out of stone. All of these would have had associated organic materials that don't survive in the archaeological record. Wood and rope and binding and a much more full toolkit, if you like, than just the bits of stone that survive. The excavating team, unearthed 189 stone artifacts, 27 different stone tool types, charcoal, fire rock, cracked rock, 86 bone fragments, like again from medium to large bodied animals, animals they've hunted. These date to around about 16,000 years ago. So this is very definitely pre-Clovis, more than 1,000 years older than anything else in the area, if you like, anything else locally to it. Another interesting point, again, this has to be taken carefully and with caution, but the archaeologists have suggested that some of the projectile points, there's no Clovis here, but some of the projectile points closely resemble those found in Japan. Now, just because one thing looks like another thing necessarily means there's a connection. But the emerging hypothesis for how people, most settlement of the Americas occurred is a Pacific coastal route, sometimes called the Kelp Highway hypothesis. Kelp after the the large seaweed that grows all the way down the Pacific coast of the Americas, but also grows in the similar fashion. It's the same, creating the same sort of ecosystem, the same kind of basis for your society, same type of hunting, etc. It stretches across through Asia and to Japan. This is in no way to suggest people sell to the Americas from Japan. What it likely means is people from Siberia, Eastern Asia, spread out along the so-called Kelp Highway in both directions. Some of them ending up in Japan, and some of them ending up in the Americas. This Clovis Ferry site is on a terrace of the river, as we can see. The arrow on the photograph is pointing to where the site is. Rock Creek, where there's a confluence of two rivers, the Rock Creek and the Lower Salmon River of Western Idaho. But that Lower Salmon River is itself a tributary of the larger Columbia River, which basically drains into the Pacific. So as Professor Lauren Davis, one of the excavators, suggests, early peoples moving south along the Pacific coast would have encountered the Columbia River as the first place below the glaciers where they could easily walk and paddle into North America. So it seems it's comparable to Monteverde. It's miles from the Pacific, but there's a large river linking it to the Pacific. So it fits nicely with the hypothesis of people travelling down the coast and then different groups heading inland. As Lauren Davis described it, the Columbia River corridor was the first off-ramp of the Pacific coast migration route. Another excavation that was published in as recently as 2019. This is from further south than Clovis Ferry and north compared to Monteverde, so it's nicely between. And this is in Mexico. Excavations by Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History at the site called Toolkit, just north of Mexico City. This is what's emerging from the excavations here is the first ever record that we have of pits being deliberately dug in order to hunt. We're back to the megafauna. We're back to large land mammals, larger than current living land mammals, and they're now extinct. In this case, it's mammoths. They've recovered 824 bones from at least 14 mammoths. And it was thought these were hunted by driving them into these giant pits, and then spear points and wounds on the remaining bones have been found to demonstrate this wasn't a sort of natural accident. These pits were deliberately constructed, and the animals themselves were killed and butchered. Study is ongoing. They're hoping to. They think there are more pits to be recovered. There's one particular mystery, according to Cordova Barradas, one of the excavators. What they found, the mammoth bones they found only include right side shoulder blades, the shoulder blades from the right. The left shoulder blades are missing. Why is that? Is the question this raises. We don't know. We never will know. What it means is there was more to hunting than just what it suggests. Certainly, there's more to hunting than just the calorific value, the food value of a mammoth, which is massive, obviously. They took away the left shoulders. They left the right shoulders. That's ritual. That's humans being weird, because humans almost always are weird. and we might never be able to answer that question, but it's of why they did it. But it's fascinating and interesting to note that they did. Other bones have been found. A jawbone and spine of a camel is found on the site. Camels were indigenous to North and South America, and also went extinct, whether they were driven extinct by humans or other things. They were there and they're now extinct. And the tooth of a horse was found at the site. Again, back to our cowboys and Indians movies, you think of certainly native North Americans as being horse riding societies. In prehistory, they weren't. The horse was indigenous to the Americas. In prehistory, it was indigenous at this time, 15,000 years ago. They were hunting them. Horse went extinct in the Americas, possibly hunted to extinction, but definitely did live there and then did go extinct. And the Plains Indians that we saw at the start of the American section only became horse users and hunters on horseback after horses were reintroduced into North America by the first Spanish colonists. Like Australia, and like I've emphasised, I hope, for America, there's no one Native American culture. They're not all based on hunting, and Native American culture existed for thousands of years, and change has a history. Culture evolves, and they weren't frozen in time. They're not a sort of Stone Age fossil. And something that's often really not thought about, North American archaeology. I presume people are familiar with large stone-built cities in Mexico, built by the Aztec, and further south in Peru by the Inca. Large stone-built cities, complex empires, a hierarchy of villages, towns, and sort of capital cities, and famously pyramids. Well, all of that existed in North America as well, except mostly built in earth, from earth. So it's not as well preserved, hence it's not so well known. Not that there are no stone-built towns in North America, but again, they're less well known. And there's a fundamental racist aspect to this as well for years, even though it was demonstrated quite early on in the history of archaeology that these mound builders, as they're often called in North America, mound building cultures, who built mounds in a huge area from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Mississippi River to the Appalachian Mountains, with the greatest concentration in the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. And not all these mounds are pyramids. There's the great, I haven't got a picture today, but look at the Great Serpent Mound. It's an incredible monument in earth mound in the shape of a giant serpent. And archaeologists and scientists demonstrated in the 19th century that these are Native American produced sites, but there was a lot of what we have to call white supremacism that suggested almost anyone. The natives were savages; they couldn't possibly have done this. It was done by the Welsh, the Phoenicians, the Vikings, the aliens. Of course, is the current fashionable idiocy. But no, these are Native American sites, and they predate European contact in North America. Different mounds for different purposes, different pyramids for different purposes. Burial mounds particularly common, and people buried inside the mounds. That was common in the so-called Middle Woodland period, 100 BC to AD 400. Later on, after AD 1000, the mounds are like their South American cousins, well, their cousins to the south. They're temple mounds. The pyramids had a temple on the top, built in wood. The earliest mounds known so far are a place called Watson Break, built as early as the 4th millennium BC. And the purpose of these is still not been determined. The picture is of so-called Monk's Mound at Cahokia Mounds. Again, it's now a World Heritage Site in Illinois, recognised for its importance. This is the largest pyramid north of Mexico, largest pyramid in the Americas, north of Mexico. It was thought to have been constructed between 900 and 955 Common Era AD. It's 291 by 236 meters at the base. This is approximately the same size at the base as the Great Pyramid of Khufu, the Great Pyramid in Egypt. This one wasn't quite as high, but it's 30 meters high. It's built up in a complex, sophisticated feat of engineering from different layers of soil and clay. The mound builders, I think, said, do not represent the only large towns. And remember, these mounds surrounded the pyramids are surrounded by towns and connected by roads. If you want to look at one other example, I would Google Chaco Canyon, which is in New Mexico, where they were building in stone. Remember, time to go into that today, but again, yes, a totally different environment and a totally different, really huge buildings at some point, again, prior to European contact. Which were abandoned prior to European contact, and we still aren't sure why. So yes, Chaco, Chaco Canyon. Look that up. Heading south again to the Amazon Basin, the Amazon rainforest. Still, despite the rate at which it's been cut down, still probably the largest area of connected rainforest on Earth. Much of it in Brazil, but in neighbouring countries as well, Ecuador, etc. The photograph on the left shows a group of Yanomami people, superbly adapted to living in that rainforest in, relatively speaking, small groups. Also, you can see from the picture on the right, building large enclosures. That's a photograph taken from a helicopter of a so-called uncontacted group, i.e. people who, as far as we know, and it was only taken a couple of years ago, people, as far as we know, still haven't had face-to-face contact with Europeans or with anyone from out with their own group, to be honest. But these are not, although they're small communities and they're hunter-gatherers largely, with some sort of horticulture, and these are often dismissed as quote-unquote primitive and frozen in time, prehistoric people. The famous book by Eric Wolf, People Without History, he was critical of that idea. He wasn't saying that is the fact. He was critical of the idea that indigenous peoples didn't have a history. Of course they do, and it's archaeology that is now revealing just how complex and tragic as well that history is. This is a photograph of a section through so-called Terraprater. So it's a cut through the soil. Terraprater is Portuguese for black earth. You can see, or dark earth. You can see sort of browny clay at the bottom, but this quite thick layer of Terraprater. This is now being found. It's a how can I put it? The rainforest is being destroyed. Whole areas of the rainforest are not there anymore. It's been deforested. That's not a good thing. But what it is enabling is doing archaeology in the rainforest is really difficult. What it's doing is exposing what is there in terms of the soil and in terms of the archaeology within it. This dark earth, to cut a long story short, it's not natural. This is a thick layer of created, like if you imagine creating compost or creating the soil that you would to put plants in. It's full of organic material, but it's full of charcoal, it's full of pottery, it's human created, and it's probably about it's at least 7,000 years old, or in some places it's at least 7,000 years old, and it's got fragments of pre-Columbian, i.e. pre-European contact pottery, all the way through it at meters depth in some places. And this, as I say, this is not natural rainforest soil. Natural rainforest soil left to its own devices is really quite thin and infertile. The recycling of material is so quick in a rainforest that the plants die and quickly become other plants. If you see what I mean, without building up a big deep layer of soil. So this had to be created by people. This is now helping to build up a picture of the ancestors of people like the Yanomami that we saw, and ancestors of other different groups of people, the Arawak, the Tupi-Guarani, the Pano, multiple linguistic groups who live there now, as we say, in these much smaller, dispersed communities. But in the past, were clearly farming, fishing, foraging, with extended networks of migration, cultural exchange extending out. We find different types of pot in different places that have clearly moved as far as the Orinoco and the Andes, and a huge amount of cultural diversity as well, going back to 9,000-10,000 years possibly. And it must have also been a lot more people than live in the rainforest now, to the extent that the Amazon isn't actually primary rainforest. It's a human-created environment, originally, and then the Amazon, as we see it now, is what happens after the humans have disappeared and jungle grows back. This has been the knowledge and information we're getting now is growing all the time through archaeology and different archaeological techniques. Again, it's a spin-off of the rainforest disappearing. If in those two pictures, once upon a time there would have been jungle over them, and once it's deforested and roads are put through, what's emerging from the aerial photographs is you see these shapes in the ground. These are earthworks. These represent former buildings, towns, villages, squares, places where they would play the so-called ball game, pyramids. Again, a whole complex of villages and towns connected by roads. And there's been large, sophisticated, dispersed communities all the way through what we now think of as rainforest, and we now think of as wilderness and minimally populated, all the way through South America, or certainly all the way through the Amazon Basin, which is a large part of South America. Archaeologists are not content with just the aerial photographs. We're doing so-called ground truthing, finding places where there may have been ancient inhabitants, and doing excavations, as you see here, in a current indigenous village, but finding pre-Columbian. These are funerary urns, and these predate European contact. Pre-Columbian, so-called funerary urns, and this is in a tiny community in the rainforest. These large vessels contain human remains. They're painted with serpents, monkeys, incredible paintings on the outside of the pots. This is relying on international funding. The Brazilian government, I have to be careful what I say, but the current Brazilian government is not favourable or inclined favourably towards its indigenous population. To the extent they often say that, you know, these people, it's not their land really. What archaeology is now demonstrating that it's been indigenous occupied land for thousands and thousands of years. Some governments don't like to hear that. We'll leave it at that. The last picture for the Americas, which I've titled CO2. That's not the title of the photograph. That's carbon dioxide. This is an Ansel Adams photograph, one of the greatest landscape photographers ever. It's called Clearing Winter Storm, taken in 1937 of the Yosemite Valley. It's stunning, it's beautiful. I've got one hanging on my wall, but it's highly problematic. It shows the Yosemite Valley as a wilderness. Ansel Adams' photographs were instrumental in extending the national park system in the US to so-called wilderness areas. That process was started by a Scotsman, actually, John Muir. And then in the late 19th, early 20th century, and then it continued into the 20th century. And as I say, Ansel Adams' photographs were a major part of bringing the wilderness to Americans of the time, showing them what needed to be preserved. And Yosemite Valley is a national park, and probably should be, I suppose. But it's problematic in that if Ansel Adams could have stood there in 1490, stood at the same spot, you know, before Europeans arrived in any numbers, certainly in North America, it wouldn't be an empty wilderness. It wouldn't have as many trees. There would be a lot of that land would have been farmed. You'd probably see smoke from hundreds of fires from villages, you know, from hearths and houses. You would see houses for a start. It was a lived-in land, not a wilderness. The concept of wilderness is problematic. There may have been thousands of people living there, burning, clearing land, trees for both hunting and agriculture. This was brought to brought to our attention in the starkest way possible, if you like. In, again, 2019 research published shortly before the pandemic in Quaternary Science Reviews, just revealing the scale of the disruption of human societies following the 1492, following Columbus's discovery, in inverted commas, of the Americas. What this research showed is this is paleo-environmental research. Obviously, there's a lot of that going on at the moment to look at increases in carbon dioxide, which is a major greenhouse gas and cause of global warming. And what the researchers discovered was a reduction in carbon dioxide levels, a reduction great enough to be measurable as a drop in temperature, global cooling, or certainly northern hemisphere cooling. Enough to be an explanation for the so-called Little Ice Age, which is a period between the late medieval period, sort of when people were starting to head off to the Americas, and well into the 19th century when there were ice fairs on the Thames, for example, and concentrations of CO2 dropped dramatically in the atmosphere, and the world dipped into much cooler temperatures. Marked cooling around the 1500s, 1600s. The explanation for this is basically that over the 100 years after European arrival, the indigenous population of the Americas dropped from 60 million to 6 million. It's genocide, basically, but mostly probably due to epidemics, like the people in the Amazon. Millions of people there probably died without ever seeing a European. The disease could be sort of passed down the line. But this is what the scientists are now calling the Great Dying. So many people, so many indigenous people in the Americas died that land was abandoned, cleared land was abandoned, trees grew back, forests grew back, the jungle grew back, and this was enough. And of course, trees and forests take in carbon dioxide more than agricultural land does. And this was so much so that it's detectable in the atmospheric CO2 levels, and made a detectable change in global surface air temperatures. That's the scale of the Great Dying. Right. So that was a very, very brief overview of the archaeology of Australia and the Americas, all of which could be hours of lectures in their own right. We now go on to a possibly even briefer overview of Polynesia, the last great area of the Earth's surface to be settled by human beings. The so-called Polynesian Triangle, not to be confused with the Bermuda Triangle. The Polynesian Triangle, marked out by the limits of Polynesia, with at the top in the north, the tip of the triangle is Hawaii, and then heading rightwards on this map, down to the bottom right-hand corner of the triangle, Easter Island, off the coast of Chile, but far off the coast of Chile, but owned by the Chilean, part of Chile officially. And then the other point of the triangle is New Zealand. Probably, to the best of our knowledge, the actual last place on Earth to be permanently settled by humans. And within that triangle, you've got hundreds of quite large islands and thousands of small islands, all making up Polynesia. As it's identifiable as a unit, if you like, of people, because across it, people have had similar material culture, and certainly the first people to arrive at its most distant point, Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, share a linguistic background. Their languages are not the same, but they're all very similar. They're of course obviously related to each other. and as I say, their archaeology and their material culture is shared enough to recognise it as dispersal of a particular people, the Polynesians. It's a huge, expansive sea. It's a huge, expansive ocean. It represents an amazing feat. It's like going to the moon, really, and navigating across that amount of water in large sailed canoes and without compasses, but clearly being able to navigate by various means. And it's an incredible, it represents an incredible feat for humans to do at the time when they did it, or at any time, frankly. And sweet potatoes. What is the and? Well, that's a chicken bone. And this is our connection to the Americas and our possible connection to the Polynesian, to the Americans. The bone is a chicken bone. Domestic chickens, one of the most ubiquitous animals in the world now, all descend from all the chickens that we eat and the eggs that we eat from them. They all descend from an Asian jungle bird, jungle fowl. Scholars, scientists, archaeologists, etc., have long assumed that chickens were first introduced to the Americas by the Spanish, by the first Spanish colonists to the Americas. The chickens were indigenous to Eurasia, were domesticated somewhere in Eurasia and spread across, and then were brought to the Americas by European colonists, particularly the Spanish. We certainly know they reintroduced the horse. They introduced European pigs and cattle, and it was thought chickens came along with this package. This chicken bone was excavated in a site in Chile, not Monteverde itself, but somewhere else in Chile. Has been radiocarbon dated, has been DNA analysed. It predates European contact, and it's now thought that the only way it could have arrived in South America, if it didn't come via Europeans, must have been across the Pacific via Polynesians. Sweet potato, on the other hand, and sweet potatoes, chicken and sweet potatoes. The sweet potato is a part of the staple diet across Polynesia, including in New Zealand today. If you go to New Zealand, you'll eat a lot of kumara, as the Maori call it, sweet potato in New Zealand today. But sweet potatoes were indigenous to the Americas, like normal potatoes. They're indigenous to the Americas, so it's long been thought, and they were a staple part of Polynesian diet. Again, long before Europeans got to New Zealand, for example. So she thought these two objects represent exchange between Polynesian peoples and indigenous American peoples, all occurring before European contact, and that has been proposed, but the teasing apart the evidence for how it happened is still ongoing. And even the results of the chicken bone analysis are actually still being questioned. It may be that it's not as old as we think it is, etc., etc. So, as ever, watch this space. Well, there's increasing evidence now that there was contact across the Pacific between, as I say, the Polynesian Triangle included Easter Island, which is off the coast of Chile if along, but if they can get that far, they could probably get as far as the mainland as well. Still another area of ongoing research. Just put this in because a lot of people will have heard of Kon-Tiki. This was and the idea that there may have been contact between Polynesia and South America is not new. It's just that there wasn't really evidence for it. But in the 1950s, Thor Heyerdahl, Norwegian archaeologist, built a balsa raft built to a South American sort of Inca type design, and sailed it to Polynesia to test his hypothesis that actually the Polynesians were South Americans, that South Americans had colonized Polynesia and became the Polynesians. The fact of contact is now accepted. Heyerdahl's own hypothesis that it was the South Americans that colonized Polynesia is not accepted. That has A, not been proved, and B, current evidence suggests another point of origin for the Polynesians, which is I mentioned another point of origin for the Polynesians, which is probably on the south coast of what is today China, somewhere on the southern coast of China. Our evidence for that, and for that being the origin point for the earliest spread into the Pacific of people who became the Polynesians, is partly based on this material. These so-called lapita pottery. These are two potsherds with decorated earthenware in lapita style, and these are both which is Polynesian. It's an early Polynesian type of pottery. The one on the left was found. Actually, they were both found on Fiji. They date to somewhere between 1590 and 900 BC. They're actually both in the. When it reopens, you can see both of these sherds on display in the Chambers Street Museum, in the Pacific section of the Chambers Street Museum, National Museum of Scotland. This style of pottery, as I say, spreads out as far as at least as far as Fiji, across Polynesia, and is represented. Is taken to in the same way as Clovis was thought to be a marker of the first people to enter the Americas, and now it isn't. But this is thought to be the sort of the marker, the material, the thing that if you find lapita pottery, you've got a site of the early Polynesians. And the reason why it's been suggested that their point of origin is somewhere in China is if you trace back, the older it gets. If you trace it back from Fiji, say date the stuff found in Fiji, the further away you get from Fiji towards the Asian mainland, it gets older and older. So yes, this is a sort of the type artifact, if you like, of the early Polynesians, the first people to spread across the Pacific, and they're almost certainly not coming from South America. The culture that is spreading, what we come to recognise as the Polynesian culture. If their material culture was excavated archaeologically, and again certainly the object on the left is in the Museum of Chambers Street again. If it was found in Europe, it would be called Neolithic. It's probably wrong to directly transcribe a term used to describe European prehistory onto Pacific Islander prehistory, but it has all the hallmarks of what we would call Neolithic, in that these are farming peoples, they're agriculturalists, they use groundstone tools. I mean, you find tools almost identical to this in European Neolithic contexts. And there are limited ways to make groundstone tools. It doesn't mean there was any contact. The one on the left is an adze head from Tahiti, French Polynesia. made out of basalt. It's 19th century. It was recovered archaeologically in the 19th century. It's the same object, if you like. It's an adze blade on the right. Beautiful, beautiful thing. That's carved from nephrite, the green stone, and this is a ceremonial adze with a wooden handle, plant fibre lashing, shell inlays, beautifully carved at the bottom of the top of the haft, the bottom of the blade. This is from New Zealand. This is Maori. This is 19th century. The same material culture is spreading right across Polynesia. It's the greenstone object. If you actually go to New Zealand, obviously they're now made for tourists. That's not necessarily a new thing. Where did the Maori come from? The New Zealand Maori. We talked about New Zealand being the last place to be settled by humans. Where was the jumping off point for the Maori? The home of the Maori, if you like, before they got to New Zealand. And that's thought to be the Cook Islands, which are north by quite some way by sea of New Zealand. The key thing to note about the Cook Islands is the people there speak a Maori language, so that suggests, and it's almost the same as New Zealand Maori, but not quite. So that also suggests it's the jumping off point, if you like. The other thing to note about the Cook Islands is they're tropical. And the people living there before Europeans got there, were a tropical agriculturist people. They were farming under tropical conditions. The object on the left is an incredible thing. It's a ceremonial adze and again with a basalt blade, a shaft of wood hollow at its lower half, decorated with elaborate motifs. These were ritual objects as much as practical objects. Obviously, the axes and the adzes could be used both ways. They were utilitarian objects, cutting down trees, carving wood. You see a wood carved idol on the right, a stylized male figure of a fisherman's god. These were carved with stone tools. But the axes and the adzes particularly also represented they clearly had ritual or spiritual significance as well. But two things of interest to archaeologists, though, and that this is also represented by the greenstone hafted adze on the right there from the Maori. What we've lost from the archaeological record is the organic materials. We find stone things, we say Stone Age, and we're forgetting that these also were compound tools, that beautifully carved wood, shell, organic materials which disappear from the archaeological record and can lead us to thinking societies and cultures were well, what we call Stone Age, but had didn't have sophisticated or artistic or aesthetic thoughts and ideals, when clearly they did. This problem of understanding and interpreting material culture produced by other cultures is made even more complicated, of course, by the fact of European colonization. The ritual adze on the left, Cook Islanders probably did make objects like this and as elaborate as this before European contact. But this particular one was probably made, and it was made in the 19th century, but it was probably made for tourists, if you like. It was made for Westerners. It was made to sell to European visitors. So it's probably not made in the identical way they would have been made before European contact. My point is just we're always interpreting, and it's doubly difficult when two societies are coming into contact. I mentioned the little wooden god, the fisherman's god. This is from Rarotonga on the Cook Islands. This is made late 19th century. This was made for local, made by locals to be used by locals. They used to place these in the prows of canoes before going to sea as a sort of good luck token. But if you go to Rarotonga now, I've been churning these out in the hundreds for tourists. So again, it's caution when explaining what the thing is made for. Whatever that may be, the Maori did get to New Zealand. We're still trying to work out the dates of the first contact. There's actually, it's still a big question in New Zealand, the dates of the first visitors, and probably there was multiple visits over time, and deliberate as well. You remember the skilled sailors, skilled navigators. There's this idea that people sort of washed up in New Zealand by accident is almost certainly inaccurate. What appears in the archaeological record, there appears to have been a mass migration to New Zealand around about 1300 to 1350 AD. So, as I said, relatively speaking, very recently. There were almost certainly earlier visits, possibly even earlier settlements, but there seems to have been a large movement of people to New Zealand around about 1300. Maori archaeology is usually divided into two periods. The later period, the post the mass migration, and actually even later, the classical period, we get this incredible wooden carving. This is it's not actually a house, it's a so-called marae. On the picture on the left, it's so-called marae. Actually, the marae is the open space in front of it, and that's a meeting house that goes with the marae. But maraes are found throughout Polynesia, and throughout Polynesian now, and throughout Polynesian prehistory. They're the village meeting space. All communal decisions were made in this sort of sacred political space. Is probably the best way of. I just suddenly thought of describing it. Sacred political space is probably. I'm going to write that down. The so political meetings, if you like, often inside the building, and decisions affecting the community, and then, well, we've all seen the haka at the rugby, but that's a genuine Maori phenomenon. Things like that occurring in the open space outside. The picture on the left is actually the marae at the University of Auckland, where it's nowadays is used for graduations and inductions of new staff. 21st century sacred political activities. The photograph on the right is also a marae. It's from French Polynesia, where it's actually referred to as a moria. You can see how it's the same language that has evolved, and that's out of use, prehistoric marae, and again these are found across the islands of Polynesia. You can wander into. I've done it on Rarotonga in the Cook Islands. you don't have to walk very far into the trees, and you'll often come across these stone-built platforms, signs of villages that are no longer in use, and the houses would be mostly made of wood, but the political space and the ritual space was demarcated with these stone walls. And it's another example of a common culture spreading out across a huge area, and evolving as well. So Maori archaeology divides into two periods, and the lovely wooden houses, I suppose, represent the classical period. I also said that the Cook Islands Maori, the ancestors of the New Zealand Maori, were agriculturists, farmers, but with a tropical agriculture, growing a suite of animals, and particularly plants, that are indigenous to the tropics, which is most of Polynesia is in the tropics, except the edges. So they arrive in New Zealand with this tropical agriculture, and of course New Zealand isn't tropical. New Zealand is temperate. New Zealand has a climate very similar to the British Isles, not the same, but very similar to the British Isles. It's a sort of equidistant from Antarctica as we are from the Arctic. It's a temperate climate. In other words, tropical agriculture just doesn't work there. So New Zealand is an example of if we think of social evolution in prehistory, always moving from hunter-gatherers to farmers. That's a general trend, but as we've seen in the Amazon, complex societies can shift to more dispersed and different or simpler societies as well, and that's what happened in New Zealand. They turn up, none of their plants will grow. So this is the so-called Moa hunter phase of settlement. They have to adapt to the environment, and their economy it becomes based upon hunting the giant megafauna, as we've pointed out in both Australia and the Americas. These are giant the Moa are giant were giant flightless birds. Well, not all giant. They were all sizes of flightless bird. Some of them truly enormous. And these are hunted to extinction. The Moa, all species of Moa are extinct in New Zealand now. The picture on the right is excavation in the 1970s of a Moa hunter camp at the mouth of a river that was excavated because it was being destroyed by erosion. 55 different bird species, the remains, of the bones, basically, of 55 different bird species were recovered, including 6 kinds of Moa: the weka, the kiriu, which is a type of pigeon, the kaka, the takahe, and the kiwi. The kiwi hasn't quite gone extinct; it's survived, but it's clinging on. All the 6 kinds and other Moas went extinct. And this Moa hunter so-called phase, and obviously they didn't just hunt giant birds, but it's a hunting-based society and a hunting-based economy. Carries on for 100 years or more, probably, or several hundred years, till the Maori can domesticate and grow crops that will survive in a temperate environment. And that's where our sweet potato comes in. That's how sweet potato will grow, survive, thrive in a temperate environment. So at some point, the sweet potato must have entered into the Maori economy ultimately from South America. But then that became the basis upon which the classical period Maori. A return to agriculturally based Maori emerges. Europeans turn up, of course, and things change again. Abel Tasman discovered, of course he didn't, but you know, Abel Tasman probably the first European to arrive in New Zealand, along with the rest of his ship's crew, of course. In the 1640s, James Cook, Captain Cook, arrives in 1769 and declares, "Oh, look, it's British from now on." And as you might expect, that's the Maori had other ideas, and New Zealand certainly represents the one place that I know of, certainly, where the indigenous people were able to impose at least some restraint on the European colonizers. I mean, Native Americans obviously fought back, but ultimately lost out. Native Australians almost certainly did fight back, and effectively were wiped out. The Maori, possibly more to do with the nature of their society, were a warrior culture. They resisted to the extent that they actually defeated the British Army, one of the few indigenous peoples to defeat the British Army in battle. There was various so-called New Zealand wars, and this is why the modern legal constitutional basis of New Zealand to this day is the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed between the Crown and the Maori people in 1840, and is uniquely was produced not just in English but also in Maori language. So to this day, New Zealand and New Zealand state is officially a blending of European culture and Maori culture. That's not to say all is perfect, but it's certainly a very different situation to that which arose in most places that were European colonies. The objects here I've picked to represent Maori resistance are probably they're representative of Maori culture. They're not representative of how Maoris actually resisted Europeans, because they did that with rifles. On the left, it's a fighting club of carved wood with a tuft of feathers, and on the right, this is actually in the New Zealand Army Museum. I don't know if that's ironic or not, but it's a so-called mere, a thrusting weapon, and it's a mere punamu. Punamu is the green stone, the nephrite that we saw the axes and the answers made from. It's a thrust weapon, target vital points of the body, especially the head and ribs. A skilled Maori warrior was said to be able to drive this between your ribs, or with an upward thrust, remove the top of somebody's skull. This was the most revered of Maori weapons. As I said, it represents the indigenous warrior culture, quite a hierarchical, quite patriarchal warrior culture. These fighting abilities are certainly real. They were probably highly ritualized when it was fighting among different Maori groups themselves. Highly ritualized. These are weapons for up close and personal combat, and it was probably 1-to-1 while everyone else watched. But this structure of society was certainly adaptable to the to fight in the British Army in the New Zealand Wars, but as I said, that was with rifled muskets and rifles. I will now read a little bit of Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, his diary, his journal from the 5-year voyage of exploration that he made as the naturalist on board HMS Beagle, where he gathered the data that enabled him to come up with the theory of natural selection. This was written in December the 20th. This was his entry into his diary, his journal, for December the 22nd, 1835, and the Beagle is at anchor off the Bay of Islands in New Zealand. In the morning I went out walking, but I soon found that the country was very impractical. All the hills are thickly covered with tall fern, together with a low bush which grows like a cypress, and very little ground has been cleared or cultivated. I was surprised to find that almost every hill which I ascended had been at some former time more or less fortified. The summits were cut into steps or successive terraces, and frequently they had been protected by deep trenches. I afterwards observed that the principal hills inland in like manner showed an artificial outline. These are the pars, so frequently mentioned by Captain Cook. That the pars had formerly been much used was evident from the piles of shells and the pits in which, as I was informed, sweet potatoes used to be kept as a reserve. As there was no water on these hills, the defenders could never have anticipated a long siege, but only a harried attack for plunder, against which the successive terraces would have afforded good protection. The general introduction of firearms has changed the whole system of warfare, and an exposed situation on the top of a hill is now worse than useless. The pars, in consequence, are, at the present day, always built on a level piece of ground. They consist of a double stockade of thick and tall posts placed in a zigzag line so that every part can be flanked. Within the stockade, a mound of earth is thrown up behind which the defenders can rest in safety or use their firearms over it. On the level of the ground, little archways sometimes pass through the breastwork, by which means the defenders can crawl out to the stockade to reconnoitre their enemies. These pars are considered by the New Zealanders as very perfect means of defence, for the attacking force is never so well disciplined as to rush in a body to the stockade, cut it down and effect their entry. I should think a more warlike race of inhabitants could not be found in any part of the world than the New Zealanders. Darwin pointing out he's not just a naturalist, he did anthropology and archaeology as well. I think it is a little bit ironic saying that he turns up with a heavily armed Royal Naval ship, while there's heavily armed European colonisers, and he suggests the Maori are the most warlike nation on Earth. Maybe. Anyway, these are what he is talking about when he says the par sites. Terraced hill forts. Certainly, if they were found in Scotland or England, they would be called hill forts. All of this terracing that you see is none of it is natural. This is human created defensive positions. And as you said, as Darwin also pointed out, these were old when the Europeans arrived. These were how the Maori had organised their own society within and among themselves. And of course, when the Europeans turned up with firearms, they changed to quite successfully respond to that. But these are found throughout New Zealand. They're often on extinct volcanoes, but in the hills. Both these examples are actually within the city of Auckland itself, with Mount Eden on the left and the famous One Tree Hill on the right, which is, I believe, the title of a TV series, isn't it? One Tree Hill. But that's One Tree Hill in Auckland. The famous power sites as recorded by both Captain Cook and Charles Darwin. And there.